Hi, let's talk about energy flow in an ecosystem. This is our third lesson in our ecology unit. Our objectives or learning targets here for the end of this lesson is at the end of this lesson, we should be able to identify the levels in a food chain. We should then be able to identify food chains within a food web. We will also be able to create a food web showing an energy flow within an ecosystem, and we should be able to compare and contrast food chains and food webs. Let's talk about what food chains are. We're going to start with food chains because they are the simplest way to represent the flow of energy from organism to organism through the process of eating, through food. So, what are food chains? Food chains represent the flow of energy from producers through different trophic levels. And trophic means feeding. So food levels of consumers. So what are we talking about when we're talking about producers and consumers, right? So we're in high school, so we're going to use a little bit advanced vocabulary here. So when we're talking about producers, we're talking about what we call autotrophs. And auto means self, and troph means feeding. So an autotroph is a self-feeding organism. We also call those producers because they produce their own food. In an ecosystem, in a food chain, we would expect for our producers to be most of the time on land ecosystems. Those are going to be things like our plants, right? Our plants, because they use energy from the sun through the process of photosynthesis. If we're talking about an aquatic ecosystem, a water ecosystem, then we're going to be talking about things like seaweeds, but also organisms like algae that go through the process of photosynthesis to produce their own food, their own energy. If you are not an organism that produces your own food, if you are not an autotroph, then you are a heterotroph. Now, we've seen this prefix before. Hetero means different or other. So a heterotroph, it means an other feeder, feeds on other organisms. And we also, of course, you've heard the term consumers. We consume our energy from other food sources. Right? When we talk about consumers, we could have based on what they eat or the types of foods that they eat. Our heterotrophs could be called herbivores, right? Our animals that eat only plants are omnivores, are animals that eat both plants and animals, are carnivores that eat meat, and of course things like scavengers, decomposers, and there's more, but we're going to stick with these four for now. If you were presented with a picture of an ecosystem, would you be able to pick out the autotrophs and the heterotrophs? Let's pick some out now. Autotrophs, remember, are our organisms that produce their own energy. So we have our beech tree, some evergreen trees over here, our flowers, grasses, our lichen on the rock, our grasses over here, of course, some plants over here. So quite a few autotrophs. And our autotrophs are going to be the very base of our ecosystem energy flow. Let's look at our heterotrophs. Now our heterotrophs, let's look for the ones that are herbivores. So our heterotrophs that eat plants, we've got our moose and our caribou. We've got maybe some small fish that feed on algae. Then we start to get into our omnivores and our carnivores. We've got our bear, our salmon, our otter. We have our eagles here and things like our swans. These are also swans, we're going to leave those. There's a little ptarmigan right here, which is just like a little bird, like a quail or a grouse. It's kind of a ground bird. And then over here, you guys missed it, you have this little butterfly. Okay, so again, in any ecosystem, there are going to be a variety of both autotrophs and heterotrophs, but when we represent a food chain, we are only going to be talking about one relationship from beginning to end. We're going to be looking at one set or one trail of energy flow. So when we talk about a food chain, our food chain is broken down into different trophic levels, right? Different food levels. And our very base level of our food, our very base of our food web is going to be our producer, right? Our producer, which is going to capture that sun energy in the form of photosynthesis and convert that energy into chemical energy, right, in the stored bonds of the carbohydrates inside the grass. So again, we're talking about energy flow, and when we're talking about energy flow, we're talking about stored energy in the form of food, right, within the organism. So here we have our autotroph. From our autotroph, which is always, our autotroph is always our first level of our food chain. That is where we start, right? We're going to put P for producer. We're going to move on to our next level. So we have our animals that eat, the producers, and these are our primary consumer. Again, consumer eats things. There is a heterotroph, and primary means one. So in this food chain, our grasshopper is our first level consumer, or our primary consumer. We're going to give him a little one there. Then comes our organisms. Our second level is going to be an organism that eats our grasshopper. This could be our secondary consumer, our bluebird. And we're going to give him a little 2 because our bluebird represents our secondary consumer, our second level. As we go on, we have our tertiary consumer, our third level consumer, and give him a little 3. And up here, we have our, at the top of this food chain, we have our apex predator, or our fourth level. We might call this, so most of the time we're going to see food chains that go to primary, secondary, tertiary. By the time you get up here, or the fancy word quaternary for 4, but we are also calling this as the apex predator because it's the very top of our food chain. Now, of course, just like the circle of life, our apex predator will eventually die, and our decomposers will break it back down, making food and providing nutrients for the grass, and the cycle will begin again. But in terms of our food chain, we're starting with our producer again as P, moving through our primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary or apex predator, the top of our food chain. Now, let's go ahead and let's talk some more about food chains. So if you were asked to identify the trophic levels of each organism in this food chain, right? We're starting off here with the leaf as our autotroph, moving into the caterpillar, our primary consumer, our chameleon, our secondary consumer, snake as our tertiary, our mongoose as our quaternary or our apex predator. Now, again, a little note down here. Notice that the arrow always moves from the lower level towards the higher level organism in the food chain. That arrow represents the flow of energy. When the caterpillar eats the leaf, the stored energy that is inside the leaf, that's stored inside the chemical bonds of the molecules that make up the leaf, are going now into the caterpillar. The caterpillar will use that energy. Another way that we can represent a food chain is through an energy pyramid. Now, an energy pyramid adds a piece of information that a food chain doesn't. An energy pyramid represents the amount of available energy at each level. Because our producers capture the sun's energy and they store the energy in their inside their cells, they have 100% of the available energy. Now along comes the grasshopper, who eats that grass and has to eat a great deal of that grass to sustain itself. Most of that energy that grasshopper takes in is going to power its life functions, right? The grasshopper has to move. The grasshopper has cell functions, mitosis, meiosis that are happening inside. Osmosis and diffusion are happening within the cells. All of those cellular functioning that we have learned about earlier in the year are happening inside. And so they're going to use up 90% of that energy, and only about 10% of the energy that came from those plants is going to be inside that grasshopper, right? Then along comes our chameleon. Our chameleon eats that grasshopper. Of course, that chameleon is going to have to eat a whole lot of grasshoppers. And chameleon also, being a little more complex, being a little bigger organism, also has to carry out the same life functions that the grasshopper did. And so it uses up 90% of its energy, and the other 1% is available to be passed on. So as we move up through our energy pyramid, we can see that there's less and less of that original available energy. There's less and less of it available because most of it has left each of the organisms in the form of heat and in the form of energy carrying out those life functions of the organisms of each level. So when we start to take food chains, and food chains represent, again, just one series of connections in an ecosystem, right? Like the one we looked at earlier, you can see that, of course, there's a lot more organisms inside that ecosystem. So how can we represent all of those different food chains without sitting and listing them out, right? Can you imagine if we were trying to show all the food relationships in an ecosystem and we were listing out every possible food chain? We would have pages and pages of food chains listed out. So one way that we can represent multiple food chains is through a food web showing interconnections. Food webs, like food chains, start with producers, right? And then we have our arrows showing the flow of energy up through our primary consumers and our secondary consumers. One thing that makes them different is that we may have one producer be the producer for several consumers. So when we're looking at a food web, we might be asked to pull out a food chain, pull out a series of relationships between a set of organisms, and we can go ahead and we can do that. So if we were to pull out a couple food chains. Let's start with our tree. Our tree is our producer. Our tree provides energy for the deer, which is then eaten by the bear. And so we have one possible food chain. Let's find another. Let's start with a different producer. Let's start with our fern. Our fern is eaten by our mouse, which is our first level consumer. That makes the mouse a herbivore, right? Because it's eating the plant. And here we have our fox at our second level because it is a secondary consumer, right? It's a second level up from, it's a second consumer in our food chain. And I could continue to do this for several dozen other possible combinations. So let's go back and talk again. How can we compare and contrast food chains and food webs? What are the advantages of showing one versus the other? Well, let's talk about some similarities, right? They both are showing the flow of energy through trophic levels. They're both starting from our producers going up to our apex predators in both situations. But what are some of the differences? The differences are in their complexity. Of course, a food chain is showing just one path of energy. If we were studying just one apex predator, we're looking at very specific relationships, and food chain would be perfect for that. If we wanted to understand the interconnectivity of different food chains and all of the organisms in an ecosystem, a food web is going to be better for that. Another thing that makes food webs different than a food chain is in a food chain, if you can imagine, in a food chain, if we were to eliminate our grasshopper from this food chain, what happens, of course, if this is removed, if this is our only herbivore, only primary consumer, we can see that there would be a massive effect on the rest of, right? The rest of the organisms within that food chain. Within a food web, there's more stability. If something happens to an ecosystem, so to one organism, again, here's our grasshopper, because a food web, it has lots of different paths, the organisms that normally rely on the grasshopper would have other options. And so our food web has more stability, can withstand more change. Again, really important fact, the bigger the food web, the more organisms, the more paths, the more stable the ecosystem is going to be. This is why biodiversity, right? The diversity, the variety of living things in an ecosystem is so very important. All right, everybody, this wraps up our review lesson on food chains and food webs. I hope you've gained something new. I hope we've lit a light bulb, and thank you very much.